Welcome everybody, this is Rev Games. We're going to be doing a little bit different of a video this time, and I'm going to title the video, or at least center the subject matter about something a little bit more game theory centric or philosophical on how to theoretically play better Yu-Gi-Oh! And this really comes from a few things that I've seen as being part of this community for a few months now, which is there are a lot of very, very good technical players that understand the technical in and outs and metagame of the uh, the game, I guess, or Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Goat format in Edison, but there are some definite, I guess, issues with the philosophy players have around a lot of different topics that I've noticed, and it's like blatant in my opinion. It's the way they play the game, or deck building, or card selection, or side decking. So I am planning on doing a series when ideas pop in my mind randomly on all those types of things, and it's going to be titled Game Theory, you know, yada 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 topic. And sorry, this idea kind of just popped into my mind. Um, it's a little late. I've had a few drinky poos. Actually, I got my whiskey right here. I'm gonna take a sippy poo. The liquor, Ricky, the liquor. But really, the other impetus for making a video like this is I can tell that a lot of other people haven't played other games, whether or not that's, other card games, which is probably more apropos to something like this, or just other games in general. And I do think the more card games you've played specifically, probably the better player you can be um, in whatever card game you choose. Same goes with decks. Like, I think that players that, just play one deck all the time probably just aren't as good of players as players that play a lot of different decks. Because those players that play just one deck are a lot more afraid to get some egg on their face and experiment, and they typically gravitate towards easy stuff, like in GOAT format, like Chaos Turbo, or in Edison, like Frog Monarchs, or Black Wings, or something like that. Or even, I mean, in Edison, a lot of the top decks are pretty easy too. Um, and I think it's a whole nother video in and of itself in terms of what's easy versus what's best. But really, the topic that we're going to be talking about today is a concept that I was introduced to unintentionally, and it wasn't something that was even talked about by a lot of pro players, but it's something I am just going to, for the sake of it, call variance throttling. And I figured a good place to start would be kind of defining what variance is if you're not familiar with the statistical terms. I'll bring up a screen here of, well, I was going to get to this before, but just the definition of variance, which is, um, how divergent an outcome would be. So if you were, let's say, rolling a die, um, or let's just say flipping a coin. That's going to be a lot easier to understand. Like if you were to flip a coin 10 times, and you had, let's say, 5 people flip a coin 10 times, there's going to be some people that get 6 heads. There's probably going to be somebody that gets, 7 heads, somebody that gets 2 heads. So there's a lot of variance in those outcomes, just since the sample of that outcome is very small, which is just the number of times in this case that people are flipping the coin. If you had, those same number of people, I believe I said it was 10 people, flip a coin 1,000 times, the difference in their outcome is going to be much, much smaller. So another way to think about variance is really just randomness. And this comes into play when you're playing a card game because they are inherently random. You draw cards every turn. Um, there is a huge component of luck in any card game, a lot more than quote unquote pro players would like to admit, and a huge skill that I haven't seen a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players incorporate or talk about is how to incorporate variance to your advantage. And this is what I call variance throttling. And this is really what I learned with Hearthstone, which is that, and it's harder to make analogs to um, uh, Yu-Gi-Oh just because the outcomes in Yu-Gi-Oh cards are a lot more well-defined typically, and I'll explain why I brought some of these cards up. But usually a card in Yu-Gi-Oh like has a defined effect. It's you summon this, it does this. It's not you summon this, you get to choose from these three outcomes, or you do this and you cast a random effect. In a game like Hearthstone, which is digital, there are drawbacks to that, but it gives you the ability to have cards that have pre-programmed effects that are completely random. And when I say random, like a Yu-Gi-Oh player's brain like cannot comprehend how random some of these effects could be. That could be, as opposed to just drawing a card like in Yu-Gi-Oh, you could just get a random card added to your hand, or you could choose out of 3 random cards. Randomness is a huge part of card effects in Hearthstone. Not so much in Yu-Gi-Oh. So I figured I'd pull up the poster boy of randomness in Hearthstone, which was Yogg-Saron Hope's End. This card was one of the most contentious cards ever printed for its time, and if you just read it, Battle Cry is just basically, it would read in Yu-Gi-Oh! When summoned. So when summoned, cast a random spell, that's the same thing as a Yu-Gi-Oh! Spell or a magic card, for each spell you've cast this game. So just totally fucking random. So if you were in Yu-Gi-Oh! And you're playing Chaos Turbo, and over the course of your game you played 10 spells. Let's just say you played, well, that'd probably be a lot, but let's just say you played 10 spells playing Chaos Turbo, or you played 10 spells playing Hero Beat. If you summoned this card, you would just randomly have 10 spells activate all at the same exact time, just totally randomly, and completely change the game state. So that could be a premature burial, that could be a mystical space typhoon, a heavy storm, followed up by a dimensional fusion, followed up by a brain control, followed up by a scapegoat, followed up by a token Thanksgiving. Like it's just totally random. So um, if that sounds ridiculous and game breaking, it's because it was. This card was one of the worst designed cards ever. And the reason for that was the outcome of this card was so random that players only played it when they were about to lose. And this really gets to the crux of what this video is really going to be all about, which is that you want to incorporate variance and randomness in the game when you are losing. You want to incorporate consistency and a lack of variance in the game when you are winning, because when you are winning, you have to play not to lose. When you are losing, you have to play to win. And that's a very, very important distinction. So what would basically happen is you are about to lose a game of Hearthstone and you drop this, and just sometimes miraculously the board gets wiped. You get a bunch of heal. It summons a bunch of tokens for you. It summons a random monster. It draws you 3 cards. And then you're suddenly ahead just because of randomness. So it turns the game into more or less a coin flip. And again, it was very difficult to find anything that's similar to this that's in the meta in Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, there are a lot of like very, very random cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Like if you think of like, oh, come on. Let me get this pulled back up. But like, if you think of Dark Master Zork, for instance. Where you at, Zork? All right. If you think of a card like this is just literally rolling a die. This card doesn't see play because um, you don't need to play cards that have variance in Yu-Gi-Oh! For the most part. In Hearthstone, you kind of do, because variance throttling is a huge skill you have to learn. So before we get into kind of what I'm talking about, I wanted to bring up another real-life example of what variance throttling was. If anybody watches March Madness, You'll know that Princeton upset in March Madness, I believe it was round one, number 2 seed Arizona. So Princeton is basically a bunch of nerds, and they were ranked number 15, and they beat number 2 seed Arizona, which is very, very unlikely. Um, Nobody was filling that out in their brackets. And what's the most interesting takeaway from this is how they did it. So if you notice the score here, 59 to 55, that's a relatively low. It's actually quite a low scoring game for a college basketball team or tournament or game or whatever the fuck you want to call it. And what Princeton's game plan was, and power to the nerds here, they knew they were worse. So Princeton said, okay, we are not as good as Arizona. So let's do a scenario analysis. Let's say we played 1,000 possessions, and that's just when you get the ball in basketball, against Arizona. Let's actually rank it up to 10,000. If we do 10,000 possessions against Arizona, what is the percentage chance that we win? And it's basically 0. Now, let's do the complete opposite of that. Let's say we had 1 possession against Arizona. We each get the ball 1 time. What's the chance we win? And the chance gets very, very close to 50-50. Because in 1 possession, anything can happen. You hit a bomb-ass 3, or you steal from them, or you get the rebound and you can just, do a fast break. So as you see, the sample size is directly joined at the hip with variance. So what Princeton said is, we're going to slow roll this game and take as few possessions as possible, because we don't want to play 1,000 possessions. We want to play as few as possible and get that number as close to 1 as possible. And 1, of course, is not doable. I mean, if you know anything about basketball and the shot clock and things like that. But they were slow rolling the game, and it worked. They played as few possessions as possible that incorporated more randomness, more coin flippiness to the game, and they beat the number 2 seed. And a lot of people are visual learners, so this is what's called a normal distribution of outcomes. In like a perfectly fair game, it's got a nice bell curve here. Let's just call this um, your probability of winning. And let's call this your probability of losing on the x-axis here to the left. So this is a normal distribution. This is what, if you were playing the exact same deck with an equally skilled player, your distribution of outcomes would look like. Now let's take a game where you're losing badly. You're getting your ass kicked. You're down 4 cards, and you're even maybe down life points. This is what your distribution of outcomes looks like. This is your win. This is your loss. So as you can see, the distribution of outcomes, like, it's very, very heavily, and this doesn't line up exactly with statistics because there are expected values to these, but in terms of the number of outcomes, your opponent is very, very heavily favored to win. Your number of expected outcomes to win is way lower to the right here on the x-axis. So hopefully that helps with a visualization. This is a normal turn 1 game. This is a game you're getting your ass kicked and you're losing. You're just very unlikely to win. Motherfucker. So the reason I'm bringing this all up is that when you are playing from behind versus playing from ahead, you have to take a very different approach to gameplay and how much variance you are going to incorporate. And as I had mentioned, I've had a very difficult time coming up with specific card examples. I had to kind of grasp at straws, like some of the Zork stuff, just because that's not how Yu-Gi-Oh was designed. But there are other cards that do incorporate variance and can be used with variance. So Deck Devastation Virus. This can just go straight up -2 for you, or you can go +6. This is a card with very high variance. So I know, again, you'd probably just jam this since you side decked it anyway, but you want to be playing cards that have higher payoffs and higher downsides when you're behind in the game. So Deck Devastation is a very good example of that. If you were playing Black Wings or Vayu Turbo and you're really far behind, and you, you know, want to just try to grind your way back into the game, and you maybe even think off the top of your head, they probably don't have a lot of low level stuff at this point in the game. You should still be going for Deck Devastation Virus anyway, because the payoff for that is game winning, and your job is to win the game, not lose by less. Another card with a very small amount of variance is Dimensional Alchemist. Let's say you're playing fairies, and you are behind, and you have a handful of random shit that has defined outcomes, or you have a Dimensional Alchemist that can send something to the grave randomly, and it might be an answer that you need that you can search back to your hand later. You should probably go with the Alchemist just because you want to be incorporating randomness and variance as quickly as possible. Same thing with Creature Swap, maybe in Goat. You say, hey, um, I don't know what their face down is. I think it probably is a Sinister Serpent, but even if your read is that it's a Sinister Serpent, you should 100% play Creature Swap. Because again, your job is not to lose by less if you're in a losing position. It is to win. And if you can have a 20% chance to, um, straight up win the game, that's a lot better than losing the game by just 1,000 life points, and you only have a 5% chance to win. I don't. There's probably a better way to say that, but um, and then really like the card that I think is the poster boy for variance throttling is Time Wizard, and I'm going to tie this back how to like actually use this in games if you're not playing any of these cards, but this can come up in Reasoning Gate, and I've experimented with Time Wizard in some of my other videos before, but the only time you use Time Wizard is if you're in an unwinnable position. Because what Time Wizard does is takes a game that you have a 5% chance of winning when they have a wall against you and a bunch of set stuff and a board, and you get Time Wizard out and you flip a coin, and the outcome of that game becomes a 50-50. And the reason people don't like cards like this is more or less just because they're pussies, to be honest. I mean, like, Yu-Gi-Oh players just are not willing to take risks and have professional embarrassment and say, oh, it's always, correct to torrential, if I can get a +1 off of it. And, then you end up losing the game anyway. Well, guess what? If you have a torrential set and you're down by 4 cards, um, you're not winning by getting a +1. You have to get greedy as shit, and you have to try to go +2 or +3, because guess what? That's the only way you win. And I keep saying win, win, win. And that's because Yu-Gi-Oh is a game of bimodal outcomes. You win or you lose. In games 1, 2, and 3, there are no extra credit brownie points if you win by 8,000 or you win by 100, or you lose by 8,000 or you lose by 800. The outcome is bimodal, so you have to play to win. And that really comes to what I think can actually help you as a player here, which again, not enough card effects have random effects to really do anything with, but what you can throttle is the number of possessions and the number of turns remaining in the game. And what you need to do if you are playing from behind in Yu-Gi-Oh is end the game as quickly as possible. Because if you're down by 3 cards or 4 cards against Chaos Turbo, or you're against Hero Beat, you are not going to win a sufficient percentage of the time if that game drags on for another 15 turns. You're just going to lose. The game is going to really reward the player that has more cards, and that is going to be your opponent, which, based on the game state, has more cards than you. How you need to throttle the variance is take the most risk with your plays play into every trap, play into every gores, say fuck torrential, fuck mirror force. I need to win in 3 turns or 2 turns, because that's the only way that you win when you're playing from behind. You have to incorporate variance. And again, this probably is going to bring a lot of hate from players that don't think like that, and they say, oh, there have been so many games where I've come back and been able to grind my way, back to card advantage, and I drew pot, and then I drew a graceful charity after that, and then you won't believe it, I got a delinquent duo, and I came back. Well, guess what? That's 2% of the time. What we're shooting for here, when you're getting your ass kicked, is an X ante 10% win rate. And it makes you look like an idiot when you play like this. You're saying, wow, they don't even play around Mirror Force. They don't play around Torrential. They just walked right into a Starlight Road. What a scrub. And that's why nobody does it. It's because bad or pro players are really, really, really afraid of looking like an idiot when there's a bunch of spectators. They know there's a stream going, and they know that people are chatting about it. They know it's going to be uploaded to YouTube and there's going to be a replay. So they make misplays. And playing safe when you're behind is a misplay. So, yeah, hopefully this leaves you guys with something, which is that if you are behind in a game, you want the game to end as quickly as possible, which is beneficial because, again, you're giving up less information, but also because that increases your win rate. So again, it adds a distinction of what is an ex post versus an ex ante outcome. And I think I kind of figured out a way to summarize this best. Ex ante means before the fact, ex post means after the fact. I would much rather have an ex ante 20% win rate when I'm really far behind and win by 100 life points than I would in ex ante 10% win rate and lose only. I totally fucked this up. God damn it. The ex ante and ex post thing. Shit. I've had a little bit too much to drink tonight. Sorry, guys. What was I gonna say? I'm trying to think about like the exact wording that I just had in my mind like 15 seconds ago. Yeah. Well, I guess I lost it. That sucks. Let me give it one more shot. Which is that I'd much rather have I'm gonna drop the ex post and ex ante thing. I would rather. Here we go. Here's what it was. I would rather have in ex ante, which means potential before the fact, win rate of 20% and lose by 7,000 life points, than I would an ex ante win rate of 5% and lose by 100. So yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of. And the point of that is that I would much rather take a higher win rate and get my face ripped off than I would losing by only 100 life points and having a much lower win rate before I know what the outcome of that game is. And again, if you play like this, you're going to lose a lot. That's the point of this. This is only applicable when you are behind. So you want to end the game as quickly as possible. You don't want your opponent to get 15 turns to 1-for-1 you on every single card and then grind you down and then BLS you or just summon an absolute zero and just beat you down. It's not how you're going to win games. So if there's another thing maybe to add to this is that also informs how you should play with when you're ahead. So if you're up 4 cards on your opponent, you don't need to be taking high risks. Yeah, you want to end the game eventually, but that doesn't mean you should be walking into mirror forces or into torrentials. And that's really where, I think you should be embarrassed if you're making those types of plays. If you're walking into a torrential or you're walking into a mirror force when you're really, really far behind, that's probably a sign you're good. If you're walking into a torrential or a mirror force or whatever it might be, some sort of board clear, when you're ahead, that's probably a sign you're bad. So that's all I have for today, guys. Hopefully this helps, and I hope it was clear enough with some of the visualizations and more specific to Yu-Gi-Oh, not necessarily card effects, just because there isn't that much in terms of random outcomes of card effects in Yu-Gi-Oh that is even remotely in the meta. But throttling the variance when it comes to the number of turns remaining in the game, because you do have control over that. Um, that's it. If you have any feedback, always helpful. Drop a comment, like, subscribe. Peace out.